At 88 years old, Billy Dee Williams lives like a man who has nothing left to prove, because he doesn't. His home in Los Angeles isn't the kind of sprawling celebrity fortress you might expect from one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces. It's not cold, minimalist, or guarded by towering gates. It's the opposite: warm, colorful, and deeply personal. Every wall seems to tell a story. Every object has history. When you first step through the gate of his mid-century modern estate, nestled quietly in the Hollywood Hills, you notice two things: the calm and the art. Not just the framed pieces, but the energy of the place. Billy Dee's house feels like a museum curated by someone who has lived a dozen lives, each more interesting than the last. The air smells faintly of paint and cedar. Sunlight filters through tall windows, landing across a large grand piano in the living room, one that's more often covered in sketches and paintbrushes than sheet music. The walls are lined with his own artwork, paintings that burst with bold color and movement. Few people realize that before Lando Calrissian, before Brian's song, before the suave charm that made him an icon, Billy Dee Williams was an artist. He studied painting at the National Academy of Fine Arts and Design in New York, long before Hollywood came calling. Even now, decades later, he paints almost every day. "Acting was my way of paying the bills," he once said, half smiling. Art was always the love affair. On a typical morning, you'll find him in his studio, a converted sunroom overlooking the canyon, wearing a paint-splattered linen shirt, jazz music floating from an old record player in the corner. Brushes are scattered everywhere, and so are half-finished canvases. He paints intuitively, layering thick strokes of color, often abstract, sometimes portrait-like. He calls it emotional realism. And in that small studio, surrounded by color and quiet, the man who once embodied Hollywood's ultimate smooth talker becomes something else entirely. A craftsman lost in creation. The House of Echoes. The home itself is as eclectic as the man. The front room feels like a time capsule of the 1970s. Rich browns, burnt oranges, and deep reds. There's an old leather couch from his Empire Strikes Back days, a rotary phone that still works, and shelves packed with vintage vinyl. Miles Davis, Nina Simone, John Coltrane. Billy Dee calls it his room of echoes. The place where he listens to music, remembers friends, and occasionally smokes a cigar by the window overlooking Los Angeles. He's never been one for trends or excess. There's no flashy marble kitchen or gold-plated fixtures. Instead, you'll find a home that feels lived in, deeply human, like its owner. He still keeps the same framed photo of Diana Ross from their 1970s films together, Lady Sings the Blues, mahogany. It's signed in looping script to Billy Dee, the one and only. Their on-screen chemistry became legendary, but what few know is that off-screen, they shared a quiet friendship built on trust and mutual respect. "We never had to talk much," he once said. "She just understood me." In one corner of the den, there's a glass display case, not of Star Wars memorabilia, but of model airplanes, small, detailed replicas of World War II fighters and 1950s jets. Williams has been fascinated by aviation since childhood. He once said that if acting hadn't worked out, he would have become a pilot. That fascination would come full circle years later when he played Lando Calrissian, the galaxy's smoothest pilot. "Flying, painting, acting, they're all rhythm," he says. "They all depend on knowing when to move and when to wait." The unexpected gentleman. For many fans, Billy Dee Williams will always be Lando, the charming, mysterious gambler who could win your trust with a grin and betray you just as easily. But the man behind the character is far gentler than his on-screen alter egos. He's been called Hollywood's last gentleman, not because he plays one, but because he is one. He still answers his own phone, still writes handwritten thank you notes, and still opens doors for guests. He keeps his wardrobe simple: pressed shirts, silk scarves, perfectly tailored jackets. His sense of style hasn't changed in 60 years. Even now, at 88, he dresses with elegance not to impress, but because, as he says, it's a form of respect for yourself and for the people who look at you. But behind that charm lies a man of eccentric habits and quiet depth. He starts every day by meditating, something he's done since the 1960s. Then he takes a short walk in his garden, feeding the koi fish in a pond he designed himself. He speaks to them as though they were old friends. "You keep me grounded," he says softly, scattering food into the water. And then there's his fascination with numbers and synchronicity. He often talks about coincidences as though they're part of a pattern, small clues in life's larger design. "I don't believe in accidents," he says. Everything connects. You just have to listen. The artist the world forgot. What most people never see is the inner life that drives him. The artist who never stopped creating even when Hollywood tried to typecast him. In his studio, near one of his abstract canvases, sits an old photo of him from 1959, 22 years old, standing in front of his first gallery exhibit in New York. He had no fame then, no fortune, no lightsabers or spaceships, just ambition. "I thought painting would be my life," he says. "Then life painted me." After his breakout role in Brian's Song, 1971, he became a symbol of sophistication and black excellence in Hollywood. Smooth, intelligent, unbothered. But fame was a double-edged sword. For years, studios wanted him to play the same archetype, the charming, confident, romantic lead. Rarely did they ask for the thoughtful artist beneath the surface. That's part of why his home feels like a sanctuary, a place where he can be both versions of himself. The movie star and the quiet man with a paintbrush. He still paints self-portraits occasionally, though not in the traditional sense. Instead, he hides fragments of himself inside abstract color fields. A swirl of blue for melancholy, a streak of gold for joy. When visitors ask which pieces are his favorites, he smiles and says, "The unfinished ones, the weird facts you never knew." Billy Dee Williams has always been full of surprises. Here are some of the stranger truths about him. The little details that make him who he is. He's ambidextrous, paints with his left hand, writes with his right. He once co-authored a science fiction novel in the 1990s, Sick Net, about psychic warfare and government mind control. He almost became a Broadway star instead of a movie icon. His first major acting dream was the theater, not film. He once did voice work for Batman, playing Harvey Dent in the 1989 film and later reprising the role as Two-Face in Lego Batman decades later, completing a promise Hollywood never fulfilled. He collects antique walking sticks, not because he needs them, but because he says, "Every cane tells a story." He keeps a chessboard permanently set up in his study. The pieces are mid-move, locked in a game he's been playing against himself for years. He never liked being called cool. Cool, he once said, is just warmth with the volume turned down. And perhaps the strangest fact of all, he still receives handwritten fan mail every week, not emails. Letters. Some are from people who saw The Empire Strikes Back in theaters. Others are from kids who just discovered Lando on streaming platforms. He answers as many as he can. Legacy of calm. At 88, Billy Dee Williams lives slowly, not out of weakness, but wisdom. His world is one of silence, color, and gratitude. He still attends small art events, signs autographs when he feels like it, and occasionally revisits old scripts. But mostly, he enjoys the stillness he earned. "I've lived 9 lives," he says, gazing out over his garden. Actor, painter, dreamer, survivor. "I've been the hero, the villain, the lover, the friend. But at the end of it all, I just want peace." And in that house, filled with light, jazz, and the faint smell of turpentine, that's exactly what he's found. For the world, Billy Dee Williams will always be the man who made smoothness an art form. But for those lucky enough to step inside his home, he's something rarer. A man at peace with every version of himself. Because behind the legend, behind the charm, behind the galaxy far, far away, there's just Billy Dee, brush in hand, painting the next chapter of his own story. The double life of Billy Dee Williams. Step outside Billy Dee Williams' Los Angeles home, and you'll see something unexpected. Not the skyline of a movie star's mansion, not the sharp edges of Hollywood modernism, but a quiet garden full of wind chimes, koi ponds, and wild jasmine. There's a peace here that feels deliberate, almost sacred. It's a reflection of the man himself. A performer who became a symbol of effortless charm, and yet spent his entire life balancing 2 identities. One public, one private. The movie star and the artist. The legend and the man. Because Billy Dee Williams didn't just play the part of cool, he created it. The making of Smooth in the 1970s, when Hollywood was still struggling to give black actors leading roles beyond stereotypes. Billy Dee Williams stepped in like something from another world. He wasn't a sidekick, or a punchline, or a background player. He was style personified, sharp suits, low voice, calm authority. Whether he was playing Louis McKay opposite Diana Ross in Lady Sings the Blues or the charismatic Lando Calrissian in Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, he didn't just act cool, he defined it. And yet, behind that surface polish was a man who had learned early on how dangerous charm could be. "It's not about being cool," he once said. "It's about being in control. Cool is what people see when you're protecting your peace." That philosophy shaped his entire life, on and off screen. As a child growing up in Harlem, Billy Dee wasn't born into privilege or fame. He shared a small apartment with his twin sister and hardworking parents. His mother, an elevator operator, and his father, a caretaker. But even then, art was in his blood. He loved drawing faces, mixing color, watching the way light fell across a wall. He'd spend hours sketching in Central Park, dreaming of painting for a living. That dream took him to the National Academy of Fine Arts and Design, where he became one of the few black students accepted at the time. He thought his life would be on canvas, not film, but art, as it often does, led him somewhere unexpected. A star is formed. By his 20s, Williams was appearing in small stage productions and television roles, his natural poise catching attention. He had a voice like velvet and eyes that carried both warmth and mystery. The kind of face the camera doesn't just see but remembers. His breakout came with Brian's Song. So 1971, the groundbreaking television film about the friendship between football players Gale Sayers and Brian Piccolo. It wasn't just a sports story, it was a story about loyalty, love, and loss. Williams' performance as Sayers earned him a Golden Globe nomination and changed how audiences viewed black masculinity on screen. He wasn't a stereotype. He was sensitive, intelligent, deeply human. Then came the films that solidified his legend. Lady Sings the Blues, He 1932, and Mahogany Line 75, both opposite Diana Ross. Their chemistry was electric to audiences. He was the epitome of the smooth romantic hero, refined, graceful, yet quietly powerful. But in private, Billy Dee was never seduced by his own image. "I wasn't interested in being the cool guy," he once said. "That's what everyone saw. I was interested in being the real guy. The one who paints, who listens, who still gets nervous before the cameras roll." That humility, rare in Hollywood, became part of his mystique, a man of two worlds. What most fans don't realize is that even at the height of his fame, Billy Dee Williams was still painting, still selling artwork under his own name. He never stopped. He painted between shoots, during press tours, even on set. He'd carry small sketchbooks everywhere, filling them with quick lines, faces, and abstractions. He said painting balanced the noise, a way to keep his identity intact when fame threatened to drown it. He once compared painting to acting in a way that only an artist could. When you act, you reveal something about yourself to others. When you paint, you reveal something to yourself. That balance, the public and private, the performer and the creator, became his survival tool. While the world celebrated his suave confidence, Williams was quietly navigating the pressures of being Hollywood's first major black romantic lead. He faced constant expectations to represent, to inspire, to be perfect. He understood the weight of visibility. "Every time I walked into a room," he said, "I carried a lot of people with me, people who never got invited in before." And so, he turned his fame into a kind of art form. His characters weren't just performances, they were symbols, reflections of how grace could exist under pressure. Return of the Lando. When The Empire Strikes Back was released in 1980, the world met Lando Calrissian, the galaxy's most charming gambler, a man who could out-talk, out-think, and outfly almost anyone. For many fans, he was the first black character in science fiction who wasn't defined by race, just by charisma and intellect. He was complex, part hero, part rogue, always human. But to Williams, Lando was something deeper, an echo of himself. He was a survivor, he said. He had style because he had to. He made diplomacy look easy. "That's how I felt navigating Hollywood." Even decades later, when he returned for The Rise of Skywalker 2019, it wasn't nostalgia that brought him back. It was gratitude. He wanted to show younger fans what endurance looked like. The eccentric collector. Back at home, his living space is a treasure chest of eccentricities that reveal who he really is. On one wall hangs a painting of Miles Davis done by Billy Dee himself. Angular, smoky, full of rhythm. Next to it, a shelf lined with first edition poetry books, Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, Maya Angelou. A hallway display holds vintage cameras from the 1950s, all still in working order. "They remind me that every story begins with a point of view," he says. In the corner of his study sits a small typewriter, a relic from his early writing experiments. Williams once dabbled in poetry and even co-wrote a sci-fi novel, Psychnet's 1999, exploring consciousness and telepathy, a subject he's still fascinated by. "It's funny," he says. "People think I only live in the past. I've always been obsessed with the future." And then, the strangest item of all, a small wooden mask from Ghana, painted gold and black. It's cracked from age. That, he says, is my reminder that beauty doesn't have to be perfect. The private philosopher. Williams has a quiet ritual. Every evening, as the sun dips behind the hills, he pours himself a glass of red wine, sits on his patio, and listens to jazz, not for nostalgia, but for rhythm. He says music keeps him young. There's something eternal about jazz. It's like conversation, never the same, always alive. He's not one for bitterness or regret. The secret, he says, is to forgive time. It takes everything, but it gives you wisdom. Ask him what keeps him going at 88, and he'll laugh softly. Curiosity, he says. As long as I can wake up and learn something new. About art, about people, about myself, then I'm still alive. He paints, he reads, he meditates. He's lived through every phase of fame, the rise, the praise, the quiet years, the rediscovery, and emerged not jaded, but content. The real legacy. Billy Dee Williams doesn't see his legacy in box, office numbers, or fan conventions. He sees it in the energy he leaves behind. The calm, confident presence that reshaped what Hollywood thought a black leading man could be. He inspired generations, from Denzel Washington to Donald Glover, to bring intelligence and grace to roles that once had none. But if you ask him what he's proudest of, he won't mention Star Wars or Brian's song. He'll point to a painting in his studio, a swirl of blue and crimson. No title, no frame. That's what I'll leave behind, he says. Not the fame, the feeling. Because to Billy Dee Williams, legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about being understood. Finally, after a lifetime of playing every part, to be seen simply as himself. And as he sits in his home surrounded by color, music, and the quiet hum of Los Angeles outside, you get the sense that he's already there. A man who's lived through the spotlight, stepped beyond it, and found something far rarer than fame. Peace. The unexpected life of Billy Dee Williams. To meet Billy Dee Williams today is to encounter a man who seems to exist slightly out of time, half in the present, half in a sepia-toned memory of elegance and rhythm that most of Hollywood forgot. He moves slowly now, with the easy grace of someone who's made peace with the passage of years. But his mind, his humor, and that unmistakable charm, they're as sharp as ever. Step inside his world, and you begin to understand something. Billy Dee Williams never lived one life. He lived several, all folded neatly into the same skin. He was an actor, a painter, a poet, a dreamer, a father, and a quiet philosopher disguised as a movie star. And even at 88, he's still discovering who he is. The actor who refused to fade. Hollywood is not kind to memory. It celebrates you one decade and forgets you the next. But Billy Dee Williams never really disappeared. He simply stepped back, the way an artist steps away from a canvas. Not out of retreat, but reflection. In the 1980s, after Return of the Jedi made him a household name, he could have chased the spotlight. But instead he chose the long road, guest appearances, voice roles, and projects that mattered to him rather than to box office executives. He voiced Harvey Dent in Tim Burton's Batman 1989, a performance that hinted at something darker and more layered. A two-face that Hollywood never gave him the chance to play until the Lego Batman movie almost 3 decades later. He joked, "It took me 30 years to finally get to be the villain." That wry humor, self-aware, never bitter, became his armor. Because while the world saw a legend, he was living something more fragile. The transition every actor faces when time no longer flatters youth. But Billy Dee handled it differently than most. He didn't chase the roles. He let the roles chase him. He understood that charisma ages well if you take care of it, not with surgery or pretense, but with stillness. The trick, he said, is to stay curious. Let the world come to you. If you stop listening, you stop living. And so he listened, to art, to silence, to jazz, to his own heartbeat. When he finally returned to Star Wars in 2019 for The Rise of Skywalker, he didn't play Lando as the slick gambler of old. He played him as something more profound, a man who had outlived empires, betrayals, and loss, but still carried his smile like a weapon. It wasn't nostalgia. It was closure, the family man few knew. For all his fame, Billy Dee Williams guarded his private life like sacred ground. He married 3 times, raised children, and never let the gossip columns define him. His son Corey sometimes worked alongside him, even standing in as his stunt double in Return of the Jedi. When asked what kind of father he was, Billy Dee smiled and said, "Present. Maybe not always physically, but always in spirit." He has a daughter, Hanako, an artist and designer who inherited his creative touch. She often visits, helping him organize his studio, updating his online gallery, or simply sitting with him as he paints. "She's my better brush," he says fondly. The Williams family rarely appears in the press, and that's intentional. He raised them to value privacy, to find meaning in creation, not attention. Even now, his home reflects that philosophy. There's no ostentation, no paparazzi-proof fortifications. Just comfort, art, and family. In the backyard, there's a small wooden swing that creaks when the wind moves. He built it decades ago for his children and never took it down. "It reminds me," he says, "that everything beautiful leaves echoes." The artist behind closed doors. Most actors, after decades in the business, hang their hats and retire. Billy Dee never did, not from acting, and certainly not from painting. If you ask him about his work, he'll pull you toward a corner of his studio, where sunlight spills across canvases thick with color. One painting shows a city skyline melting into a saxophone. Another depicts two figures made entirely of brushstrokes, neither quite human nor abstract. He paints like a man chasing light. "I paint feelings, not things," he says. "You can't photograph a feeling. You have to wrestle it out of color." His work has been exhibited in galleries from New York to Los Angeles, collected by fans and fellow artists alike. But he doesn't paint for money. He paints to remember. On the far wall of his studio, there's a small painting of his mother, done entirely in shades of gold and gray. She never got to see his fame, but she was the one who encouraged his art when he was a child, scraping together coins for paint and paper. "She told me," he says softly, "if you make beauty, you'll never be poor." That's why he paints every day. Not to sell, not to impress, but to stay connected to the boy who once dreamed with charcoal on paper in a Harlem apartment. His quirks, his humor, his truth. For someone so graceful, Billy Dee Williams has a disarmingly goofy side. He collects wind-up toys, tiny robots, vintage cars, tin astronauts, dozens of them sitting on his bookshelf. "They remind me to keep moving," he laughs, "and to never take myself too seriously." He's also obsessed with space exploration, not just because of Star Wars, but because of genuine curiosity. He reads astronomy journals, keeps up with NASA missions, and has a telescope on his balcony. Sometimes he'll stay up until 2 a.m., tracing constellations. "When I look at the stars," he says, "I feel like I'm looking back at every role I ever played." And then there's his love of ritual. Every Sunday, he makes tea at exactly 10 a.m. Loose leaf jasmine brewed in a small porcelain pot he bought in Kyoto in the 1970s. He sits on his porch, sips slowly, and writes short reflections in a leather-bound notebook. The entries are poetic, almost meditative. "The light is kind today." The city hums in the key of F. Old jazz sounds like forgiveness. He's not a religious man in the traditional sense, but there's a quiet spirituality in how he moves through the world. "I believe in art," he says. "That's my church. That's my way of praying." The legacy of stillness. When people talk about Billy Dee Williams, they often mention his charm, his elegance, his cool. But the truth is, he never performed coolness. He lived it by mastering stillness. In a business built on noise, he's the one who learned the power of silence. He never chased scandal, never fed controversy, never needed to shout to be seen. His presence was enough, and maybe that's the strangest, most beautiful thing about him. In a culture that measures success in speed and spectacle, Billy Dee Williams built his legacy on grace. He once said, "I don't want people to remember my face. I want them to remember the way I made them feel." You can feel that when you walk through his home. In the warmth of the rooms, in the scent of turpentine and old books, in the faint echo of jazz on a lazy afternoon, the place feels like him, timeless, soulful, quietly extraordinary. The final frame, at 88, Billy Dee Williams doesn't talk about retirement. He talks about gratitude. He still paints, still dreams, still writes little notes to himself that begin with the words, "Remember this." He laughs when people call him a legend. Legend just means old, he jokes. But his eyes, those calm, steady eyes that once melted movie screens, tell another story. They say he's content. They say he's seen it all and still believes in beauty. They say that fame fades, but style, real, inner style, lasts forever. And as the sun sets over his quiet Hollywood garden, you can almost picture him standing by his koi pond, hands in his pockets, whispering to no one in particular. "I didn't come here to be remembered. I came here to make art. The remembering is up to you." Because that's Billy Dee Williams, the man who turned cool into poetry, who lived like a painting in motion, and who, even now, paints every day as though the canvas itself were listening. The curtain call. When people think of legends, they think of noise, the explosion of fame, the thunder of applause. But Billy Dee Williams, he prefers the quiet, the brushstroke after the color dries, the jazz note that lingers after the song ends. He's seen entire generations rise and fall in Hollywood. He's watched the industry reinvent itself a dozen times, but he never bent to it. He remained constant, like a heartbeat under the noise. And as he looks back on nearly 9 decades of life, there's no trace of regret, just a long, satisfied exhale. "I didn't need to conquer the world," he says, looking out at the city lights from his balcony. "I just needed to understand it." Then he smiles, that same calm, unbothered smile that made him an icon. "And now," he adds, "I paint what's left of it." The night wind moves softly through his garden. Somewhere inside, a jazz record spins. And in that moment, you realize Billy Dee Williams doesn't live in the past. He lives in the rhythm of now. Not a man chasing immortality, but a man who's already achieved it, quietly, gracefully, and entirely on his own terms.